The city never slept. It buzzed and blared and breathed down people's necks, pulsing with neon signs and deadlines, and the constant hum of voices that never seemed to stop. For Ethan Reed, life in the city was a checklist of noisy mails to answer, deals to close, expectations to exceed. He was successful, admired, and completely exhausted. On a rare Saturday afternoon when his calendar had a blank space something he hardly recognized anymore, he wandered into a quiet part of town, hoping to outrun the echoes in his mind. That's when he saw it, a small shop tucked between a florist and a record store. No neon lights, no advertisements screaming for attention. Just a hand-painted sign above the door that read, "The Quiet Nook." Its window was filled with books, wildflowers in mismatched vases, and a sleeping cat curled up on a cushioned dot. Something about it made him stop Dot inside. A bell chimed as he opened. The door and the chaos of the world outside melted away. The air smelled of lavender and old pages, and soft piano music played somewhere in the back, and there she was, seated cross-legged on a cushion behind the counter, barefoot and wearing a cardigan 2 sizes too big, was a woman reading a weathered book like it held all the answers the world forgot to ask. She didn't look up right away. She turned a page first, smiling softly to herself, as though she was savoring the silence. Ethan cleared his throat. She looked up then, and something in the air shifted Dot. Her name was Lila Avery, and her eyes, the color of worn denim and morning skies, met his with quiet curiosity. "Welcome," she said, her voice warm and low, like a song meant only for one person. "First time here?" He nodded. "Yeah, I was just walking." Lila tilted her head slightly, as if trying to read between the lines of what he wasn't saying. "Well," she said, standing and tucking her book under her arm, "then you found the right place. We specialize in peace here." Ethan chuckled. "Peace, huh? That's rare." "It's not rare," she replied, her smile patient. "It's just quiet. Most people forget how to listen for it." There was something unshakably calm about her, the way she moved, the way she spoke, as if the whole world could be chaos, but her presence would always be steady. He didn't realize how tightly wounded he'd been until he felt himself exhale. Dot. She led him to a corner of the shop where a reading nook was tucked beneath shelves of poetry and old journals. "Tea?" she asked. He hesitated. "Sure, surprise." Lila disappeared into a back room, returning with a cup of chamomile and honey in a handmade ceramic mug. Dot. He took a sip. "This is good. I only serve what I love," she said simply, then returned to the counter. Ethan sat in that corner for over an hour, pretending to browse a book of nature essays while stealing glances at her. Every so often, she looked up and smiled, not the kind that demanded anything, but the kind that understood. When he finally stood to leave, the cat stirred and stretched with a yawn. Lila walked him to the door. "Thanks," he said, unsure why. He meant it so deeply. Dot. She gave him a curious look. "Come back sometime. The world will still be loud, but I'll keep this place quiet for you." He left with a strange lightness in his chest, not excitement, not attraction in the usual sense, just ease. Like something had shifted within him. He didn't realize it then, but something had. And her name was Lila Avery. For the next 2 weeks, Ethan Reed returned to the quiet nook more times than he cared to admit. At first, it was under the guise of needing a break, just a cup of tea, just a quiet place to think. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was her, Lila Avery. She had a quietness that wasn't passive. It was intentional, a calm presence that anchored the storm in others. Ethan wasn't used to that. In his world, noise meant power, noise meant success, and quiet? Quiet meant you were falling behind, but Lila had rewritten the definition. She didn't need attention, she didn't crave praise. She existed like morning light, soft, essential, and overlooked until you finally stepped into it and realized you'd been cold for years. Lila's world was a rhythm of stillness and story. She ran the bookshop herself, inherited from her grandmother who had believed fiercely in slow living and handwritten letters. The walls of the shop were lined not just with books, but with small reminders to breathe. A shelf of tea blends she made herself, handwritten poems from local visitors pinned to a corkboard, and calming playlists she curated with the care of someone tending to a garden. She lived in the tiny apartment above the shop. Her mornings began with stretching near the open window, feeding the cat named Bowl, and watering the wildflowers that grew in chip pots. She spent her afternoons reading, recommending books to curious souls, and restoring the quiet in anyone who walked through her door. But what no one knew, what Ethan couldn't see yet, was that Lila's peace came at a cost. She had once lived a very different life. 3 years ago, she was a successful editorial assistant in a publishing house that chewed up ambition and spat out burnout. The noise had followed her everywhere: phone calls, meetings, crowded trains, sleepless nights. She had given everything and still felt like nothing, until one morning, when her hands trembled while pouring coffee and she realized she didn't remember the last time she felt joy. She'd walked away from it all, from the relationship that had turned into silence, from a job that defined her but didn't nourish her, from the life everyone told her was worth chasing. Riverwood, the quiet town where her grandmother had once lived, called her back like a soft hymn. She reopened the bookshop, poured herself into peace like others poured themselves into ambition. It didn't pay as much, but it gave her something else: stillness, meaning, healing. Ethan, meanwhile, lived in a world of sound. He was the head of a boutique marketing firm, one that demanded precision, energy, charisma. His days were filled with presentations, deadlines, and managing teams that looked to him for direction. His phone rarely left his side. Silence was something he feared. It made room for thoughts he didn't want to confront. He was raised in a house where success equaled love, where his father measured affection and academic awards and career achievements. He had been climbing for so long, he never questioned why, until he met Lila. And now, he sat in her shop during late afternoons, drinking her tea and asking questions about the books she recommended. He told her he used to read as a kid, but life got in the way. She just smiled. Life doesn't get in the way, Ethan. We forget we're allowed to pause. He started reading again, slowly. First a chapter during his commute, then in bed at night. Lila had a way of suggesting the exact story he didn't know he needed. Stories about resilience, healing, gentle love. In return, Ethan shared pieces of his world with her too. One rainy evening, he brought her a portfolio of branding designs he'd worked on, quietly curious about her thoughts. She leafed through them with care, pausing over one in particular that used soft, muted tones and nature-based motifs. This one feels different, she said. Ethan smiled. That one's mine, not a client's. I can tell, she said, and her words sat with him long after he left. Their connection deepened, not in grand moments, but in small, meaningful ones. Ethan began staying past closing, helping her restock shelves or hang up new handwritten signs. Lila began keeping an extra cup ready at the counter before he arrived. They didn't always talk. Sometimes they read near each other, sharing space and silence that felt more intimate than conversation. Neither of them had said anything yet about feelings, about attraction. It was too early, too fragile. But something unmistakable was growing between them. One evening, as Lila locked up the shop and turned to walk upstairs, Ethan paused beside her. Do you ever miss the noise? He asked quietly. Lila looked up at him. Sometimes. But only when I forget why I left it. He nodded slowly. I think I'm starting to understand. The days began folding gently into one another, Ethan didn't plan his visits anymore. He simply found himself at the quiet nooks, sometimes between meetings, other times on his way home. Lila had stopped asking why he was there. She just poured his tea and gave him that knowing smile, like she'd been expecting him all along. Started as casual company bloomed into something more layered. He began noticing things, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she read something particularly beautiful, the way she lit a single candle on the counter at sunset, as if marking the transition between the noise of the day and the peace of evening, the way her laughter sounded like the first breeze after a long, hot day. It wasn't loud. What was happening between them. It was slow. Intentional. Undeniable. One Thursday. Rain battered the windows as thunder rolled above Riverwood. Lila had just finished closing early when the bell over the door chimed. Ethan stepped in, rain dripping from his coat, tie half loosened, and eyes drawn to her like gravity. She gave him a curious smile. "You came through a storm?" He shrugged. "The city was louder today. I needed quiet." Without another word, she led him to the back of the shop, where a second-floor loft overlooked the bookstore below. "Come on," she said gently. "I want to show you something." The loft was simple, cozy armchairs, stacks of poetry, and a skylight above where raindrops tapped like soft fingers. She lit a small lamp and handed him a blanket, then curled up across from him with her legs tucked beneath her. For a moment, they just listened to the rain. "Do you ever feel like you're running on autopilot?" Ethan asked, his voice low. "All the time," Lila replied, "but I learned to pull the brake." He looked at her, searching her eyes. "How?" "I stopped living for noise," she said softly, "and I started chasing stillness, moments like this." There was a long silence between them, not uncomfortable, but charged with meaning. Ethan shifted closer, elbow on his knee. "You know, I don't think I ever realized how much I needed quiet until I met you." Her eyes lifted to his. "You didn't need quiet, Ethan. You just needed to be heard in it." He smiled, slow and sincere. "Then you're the first person who ever listened?" She blushed but didn't look away. That night, as thunder rolled over the roof and the storm pressed close around them, something passed silently between them, something tender, unspoken, and too fragile yet to name. Not a kiss, not even a touch, but a glance that lasted longer than usual, that said, "I see you. I'm beginning to feel something I didn't expect." Over the next few weeks, their time together became a rhythm neither of them questioned. They visited the Saturday market together, Lila picking out dried lavender and fresh bread, Ethan carrying her tote bag without protest. She invited him to her kitchen once to taste a new tea blend she was experimenting with orange peel and cinnamon. He told her it tasted like autumn. She smiled, scribbled it into a notebook, and named it First Fires. One evening, Lila returned. The favor. Ethan invited her to a rare open gallery event where his firm had curated a brand redesign for a charity he supported. It was a sleek, elegant venue far from the rustic charm of her shop, but she dressed in a soft blue dress and went anyway. He watched her from across the room, her presence like a calm ripple in a sea of sharp suits and bold voices. She didn't try to stand out, but she was magnetic in her simplicity. "You're not like the rest of them," she whispered to him when they stood beside the art piece he'd helped design. He leaned in, his voice low. "Neither are you." They walked home afterward, their fingers brushing occasionally, but not quite lacing together. It was Ethan who stopped suddenly and said, "You calm me in ways I didn't know I needed." Lila turned, her breath caught in the still night. "You see me in ways I thought no one would." Neither said the word for what was blooming between them, but both felt it. One night, after the shop closed, Ethan stayed behind. Lila was organizing the shelves, and he was helping without being asked. A soft record played in the background. Ella Fitzgerald, slow and soulful. He glanced at her, saw a strand of hair fall into her face, and reached out before thinking. He brushed it back behind her ear, fingers barely grazing her cheek. She froze at his touch, eyes wide. Not scared, just surprised. "I'm sorry," he said softly, pulling back, but Lila stepped forward. "I'm not," she whispered. They stood there, breathing the same breath, hearts thrumming in time. He didn't kiss her, not yet. Instead, he whispered, "Are we moving till something?" Her smile was barely there. "I think we already are." In the quiet of the bookshop, as the record played and moonlight painted silver shadows across the shelves, Ethan and Lila stood facing one another, two souls who had lived among noise, and now found something sacred in stillness. Not everything had been said yet, not every fear had been named, but something was unfolding, and it was beautiful. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself slowing down, not just in pace, but in heart. With Lila, time didn't race. It unfolded gently, like morning light crawling across wooden floors. Her presence didn't demand attention, it invited it. Being with her felt like stepping into a poem you didn't realize had been written just for you. Their relationship blossomed, not in grand gestures, but in quiet patterns. He brought her tulips one morning because she had once mentioned. They reminded her of her mother's garden. She left little bookmarks with handwritten notes tucked into his books, quotes she thought he'd love, thoughts she didn't know how to say aloud just yet. Their worlds had started to intertwine. Not suddenly, but seamlessly. Ethan began keeping a spare set of clothes in the apartment above the shop, just in case he stayed late. He often did. They shared dinners at her small round table, surrounded by books and the smell of rosemary roasting in the oven. Lila wasn't a fancy cook, but her food always tasted like comfort. "You cook like you love quietly," Ethan had once said. She tilted her head. "That's the only way I know how to love." He didn't respond then, but something inside him stirred. One Sunday afternoon, Lila took him to the woods just beyond Riverwood, where the trees grew wild and a narrow creek carved through the earth. It was her favorite place, a space that never changed, even when everything else in her life had. They walked in silence for a while, their boots crunching leaves beneath them, a thermos of tea shared between them. Lila stopped near the edge of the creek, sitting on a flat rock. "I used to come here when I was overwhelmed," she said. "When my thoughts got too loud." Ethan sat beside her. "And now?" "Now I come here with you," she said quietly. "And it's not about escaping anymore. It's about sharing." The silence. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers, feeling the warmth of her skin. "I used to think I had to earn love," he said, his voice barely above the wind. "Achieve it, prove myself worthy of it. But with you, I just breathe." Lila turned to him, eyes soft. "That's because I don't want anything from you, Ethan. I just want to be with you." He leaned his forehead against hers, emotion welling behind his eyes. "You feel like home." That night, back at the shop, she showed him a box of old letters her grandmother had written, letters full of advice about love, loss, and quiet joy. One read, "Find someone who listens to your silence, who doesn't try to fix you, just loves you where you are." Lila handed the letter to him. "That's who I want to be." Ethan smiled, brushing her cheek with the back of his hand. "That's who you already are." Their first kiss happened on the balcony above the bookstore. The moon was high, a soft wind brushed against them, and candles flickered along the railing. It wasn't rushed or breathless. It was slow, tender, the kind of kiss that felt like exhaling. Afterward, Lila leaned against his chest, her head beneath his chin. "I wasn't sure I'd ever feel this again," she murmured. "What?" he asked softly. "Safe." He wrapped his arms around her tighter, holding her like a promise. "You're not alone anymore." From then on, their days bloomed like seasons shifting gently into spring. He invited her to his company's quiet rebranding project, offering her a freelance design opportunity. It was a small job designing calming visual identities for wellness. Brands that it meant something to her. You trust me with your work? She asked, surprised. I trust you with more than that, he said, with a smile that made her cheeks flush. Lila, in turn, began writing again. Not just notes or poems, but stories. Stories she hadn't dared to tell in years. Stories about softness, strength, and quiet love. She showed them to Ethan one evening, heart pounding. He read them in silence, then looked up with misted eyes. You write like you live. And how's that? She asked nervously, honestly, and with more heart than anyone I've ever met. On her birthday, Ethan took her to the top of a hill just outside town where fireflies dance like stars. On Earth. He set up a blanket, brought pastries from her favorite bakery, and a vintage record player powered by a tiny portable speaker. He held out his hand. Dance with me, she laughed. There's no one else out here. Exactly. They danced under the stars, her cheek pressed against his chest, their bodies swaying in rhythm with the soft hum of music and the stronger hum of something deeper belonging. I used to think I'd never find this, she whispered. This? He asked, pressing a kiss into her hair. Someone who doesn't make the world louder, ... just makes me forget the noise. At night, in the quiet moments before sleep, they shared dreams that Ethan confessed he wanted to one day open a creative agency that focused on stories that mattered nonprofits. Artists, voices that were often ignored. Lila confessed she wanted to publish her own book. Not for recognition, but to give something gentle back to the world. Then we'll build it, he said. Together. She smiled in the dark. Even if it's slow? He kissed her hand. Especially if it's slow? They weren't perfect. They both had wounds. But where the world had once told them to be louder, faster, stronger together, they learned to be softer, quieter, more open. In each other, they found something neither of them thought they deserved. Peace. The shift wasn't sudden. It was subtle, like the first cold breeze after weeks of spring warmth. Ethan had been quiet lately. Not the peaceful kind of quiet Lila had fallen in love with, but the distant kind, the distracted kind, the kind that carried worry behind his eyes. Even when he smiled, it started when a major client reached out to his firm, a global tech brand looking for a bold, fast, high-stakes campaign. The kind of deal that could launch his agency into a new league, exposure, capital, prestige, but it came with a condition: relocation to New York City. A 6-month partnership that required his full attention on-site meetings, networking, late nights, and a different version of Ethan. He didn't tell Lila right away. He convinced himself it wasn't real yet, that he could manage both. That maybe, somehow, their quiet life wouldn't have to change, but the space between them did. Lila noticed the way his hands trembled slightly. When he checked his phone, how he stared out the window longer, how he kissed her goodnight but stayed awake after she fell asleep. One evening, as they sat together in her apartment, sipping tea in silence, she finally asked, "Are you okay?" Ethan paused and nodded too quickly. "Just work." She watched him for a long moment. "Is it something big?" He hesitated. "Possibly, but it's nothing to worry about." Lila didn't press. She trusted him, but her heart stirred with unease. A week later, the truth came out. They were walking home from dinner when his phone rang. He tried to ignore it, but she gently nudged him. "You've been jumping every time it rings. Just answer." He did. She didn't mean to listen. But when she heard the words, New York relocation, her steps slowed. After he hung up, he turned to her with guilt in his eyes. "You weren't supposed to hear that." Her voice was soft. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to worry you," he replied. "It's temporary. Just 6 months. Maybe less." 6 months is a long time when your heart lives somewhere else. His jaw tightened. Lila, this opportunity could change everything. It's what I've worked for. She nodded slowly, trying to keep her voice from shaking. I know, and I'm proud of you, but we built something real here. Does that still matter? He stepped forward, hands in hers. Of course it does. You matter. But I'm afraid if I don't take this, I'll regret it. And if you do take it, she asked, what will you regret then? They didn't fight. They never raised their voices, but it still hurts sometimes. The softest goodbyes leave the deepest echoes. The night before he left, they sat on the floor of the bookshop. She lit every candle she owned, the shadows dancing across their memories. I don't want to lose you, she said quietly. He brushed a tear from her cheek. You won't. But the noise, she whispered. You said it drowned you once. What if it pulls you back in? He looked down. What if I have to go there, Dada? To know for sure who I want to be? Lila took his face in her hands. Then promise me, don't forget the quiet. Don't forget us. I couldn't if I tried, he said, kissing her forehead. But when the door closed behind him the next morning, it felt like silence had lost its warmth. Ethan's life in New York was everything he remembered. Late nights, fast elevators, glass walls, powerful people. His name on headlines. His work on screens, but something was missing. No tea waiting on the counter. No handwritten notes tucked into books. No woman whose quietness steadied his storms. He called Lila every evening. She always answered, always listened. But her voice carried something he hadn't heard before. Distance, the kind that comes not just from miles, but from the slow erosion of presence. Lila kept the bookshop open. She smiled at customers, brewed her teas, and pressed tulips between pages of old books. But her silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy. She missed his laugh, his questions, the way he looked at her like she was the only sound he needed. Every night, she climbed the stairs to the apartment above the shop and sat by the window, holding the letter her grandmother had once written. Love that is real doesn't shout, it stays. Even when the world calls you elsewhere. She stared out at the town lights, whispering to the stars, I just want him to remember who he is when he's with me. 3 months passed, then 4. Phone calls slowed. Text replies came later, and one morning, Lila stood in the middle of the shop and realized her peace was beginning to ache. Ethan stood in a room full of light and noise. The New York CMPAIGN had gone viral. His agency had tripled its exposure. He should have felt victorious, fulfilled. Instead, he felt empty. That night, at the celebratory gala, he stood beside floor-to-ceiling windows, champagne untouched in his hand. Conversations swirled around him, but none of them reached his heart. He was surrounded by everything he thought he wanted, but not by the person who taught him how to want differently. His phone buzzed. It was a picture from Lila, just a tulip in a teacup, placed on the windowsill of the quiet nook. No message, just the image, and somehow it broke him because that tulip had been the first flower he brought her. Because that windowsill was where she once sat, reading while waiting for him to return. Because that image was a quiet way of saying, I remember you. Do you still remember me? Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat on his hotel bed, staring out into the bright city, haunted by silence, his own silence. The silence he had allowed to grow between them. He thought of the bookstore, of Lila's laugh, of the way she listened. Without needing to fix anything, he thought of how she had made space for him not to be more, but to be enough. And he realized something. He had become the very noise he once ran from. The next morning, he packed his bags without waiting for approval, without checking the schedule. He booked a one-way ticket home. To her. It was raining in Riverwood when he arrived. Soft, quiet rain, the kind that didn't demand attention but still found its way into everything. He stood in front of the quiet nook, heart pounding, unsure if she'd still want to see him. Inside, the shop looked just as he remembered, warm, glowing, timeless. Lila stood behind the counter, her hair tied up in a loose bun, a cup of tea steaming beside her. She looked up when the bell rang. Their eyes met. She didn't move at first. He stepped forward, voice shaky. I couldn't breathe there anymore. Tears gathered in her eyes. He continued, his voice breaking. I kept hearing your words in my head about silence, about slowing down, but I was drowning in a place I thought would make me whole. Lila walked around the counter slowly, as if afraid the moment might vanish. I forgot who I was without you, he whispered. But being away made me remember what peace really is. She stood in front of him now. What is it, Ethan? You, he said, placing a hand gently over his heart. It's always been you. She didn't speak. She just reached up and cupped his cheek like she had that night on the floor before he left. Only this time he didn't pull away. This time he leaned in. Their kiss wasn't like the first dot. It was filled with ache and longing and love rediscovered. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. You came back. I never stopped coming back to you, he said. Even when I was far away. That evening, they closed the shop early. No words were needed as they lit candles, brewed tea, and sat near the window, two hands clasped. One heart rediscovered. Outside, the world remained loud. But inside, there was only quiet, and it had never felt more like home. Autumn came gently to Riverwood. The leaves turned copper and gold. The wind carried the scent of cinnamon and distant bonfires. And at the quiet nook, peace had settled in once again, not as an escape, but as a beginning. Ethan stayed, not temporarily. Not in between projects. He left the firm in New York, handed it off to his partners with a handwritten letter that ended simply with, success means nothing if it costs you what makes you feel alive. Instead, he started a creative studio in town, a small, sunlit space above the bakery. He worked with nonprofits, artists, and small businesses, projects with purpose, stories that mattered. He called it Quiet Light Creative, and Lila helped. Design the logo. Lila, in turn, finished her first novel, the one she had been too afraid to write for years. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was about a woman who ran a bookstore in a quiet town and a man who forgot how to breathe until he met her. It was filled with tea and tulips and soft nights. And though the world outside might call it small, to her it was everything. She gave Ethan the first printed copy. He opened to the dedication. For the man who didn't ask me to be louder, he simply learned to listen more. He cried, right there in the middle of her shop, and she just smiled and handed him a tissue, like she always knew the words would find their way home. Their love didn't become a spectacle. It became a ritual. They had dinner together every Friday, at the same small table, a candle always burning between them. On Sundays, they went walking in the woods near the creek. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't, but they always held hands. Ethan would bring her flowers, never a bouquet, just one or two blooms he knew she loved. Lila would leave him handwritten notes in his planner, usually starting with slow down today. They didn't talk about forever in grand speeches. They lived it in gentle moments. One chilly evening, as the first snowflakes began to fall, Ethan brought her to the loft above the shop, their favorite space. It was lit with candles. The window, frosted with soft flakes outside. He held a small box in his hand. I've always thought love was supposed to feel big, he said. Loud, obvious, but then you taught me that real love isn't about being heard by the world. He opened the box. Inside was a ring, simple, vintage, with a tiny engraving inside that read, My Quiet Heart. Ethan's voice trembled. It's about being heard by one person, one soul, and I don't want to spend another day without you hearing mine. Lila's eyes filled with tears. I said yes, the day you walked into my bookstore. She whispered Dot in the stillness of falling snow. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and she slipped into his arms. Their wedding was small Dot held under the trees near the creek, the same place where silence once brought them closer. She wore a dress the color of soft cream and tulips braided into her hair. He wore a navy vest, no tie, and shoes covered in grass by the end of it all. Only close friends. Only soft music. Only joy. Years later, people would come to the quiet nook not just for books, but for hope. They'd hear the story of the quiet woman and the man who remembered how to breathe. They'd sit in corners, drink tea from mismatched cups, and feel something sacred between the pages and the silence. And sometimes, if you walked past the store just after closing, you'd hear laughter. Soft, familiar, like the sound of home. Too. Souls who didn't need the world's attention because they had each other, and that was enough.